I want to bring in my panel this afternoon, Liberal MP Tim Wilson and Labor MP Anne Ali. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Patricia.
Tim Wilson, I want to start with you. Do you still support that legislated superannuation increase?
What I've always said is that I think these sorts of proposals should be reviewed for their benefit for Australians, and what we know is that, and the RBA has confirmed it, the Grattan Institute's confirmed it, ACOS has said it, Treasury has said it, is that if you increase it, it's going to come at the cost of real wage growth. And I would have thought, when in an environment where we want to boost wage growth, that we should consider all options, and that's a sensible and prudent way to approach public policy. That's
not the government's policy, as you know. The government says...
No, but that's the joy of being a backbencher, Patricia. You're allowed to, from time to time, proffer your own thoughts, and I believe in prudent, responsible budget management. I believe in people having freedom to choose, and I believe in people saving for their retirement, and I have an open mind on these topics.
OK. I want to explore that more with you, because there are others too, as I outlined there. You think that the government should review this legislated increase now?
Well, we're already reviewing a lot of issues as part of the retirement income system review, making sure that older Australians have enough money to retire on, the next generation to be in the best position they need to be, but also to make sure that the system is actually working for Australians. And, you know, what we know is some people putting in submissions saying, no, we should increase these compulsory superannuation guarantee further and decrease the pay packets of Australian workers today. Now, the Victorian government's done that, and Anthony Albanese today has said he's for lower wages for Australians. He's entirely legitimate and is right to argue that point, but that's the consequence, and we need to understand that.
To be clear, he didn't say he was for lower wages. That's
the consequence of what he wants, and that's what the Treasury is saying, the RBA is saying, ACOS is saying, the Grattan Institute is saying. And so, you know, you've got to accept that there are trade-off and consequences around these issues, and we've got to make sure that we're upfront about it.
Just to be clear, you say that that's the consequence, but it's the government's policy. So you're saying the government's policy, if implemented, would be to lower wages, in your view?
No. What we've got is...
But that's the government's policy.
What we have is a legislated increase that was introduced by the previous government. It's going up. It automatically goes up. We have a retirement income system review at the moment to look at these sorts of issues. That's also the government policy. But in the end, if you want lower wages, then ultimately, or lower wage growth, then we're going to continue down this path.
OK. Anne Ali, we heard Anthony Albanese's speech today where he argued strongly for this, but it is true there are groups like ACOS, usually more on your side than the coalitions, traditionally at least, and even the Grattan Institute saying actually there is a consequence on wages. Do you accept that?
OK, so there are 2 points that I want to make on this, Patricia, and particularly in response to what Tim was saying as well. And the first point that I want to make is that wage growth and superannuation aren't necessarily mutually exclusive interests to pursue. And one of the points that Anthony made in his speech was if you have strong economic growth and strong productivity, you can address both. You can have superannuation and you can have wage growth. Wage growth is not dependent on superannuation, and in fact an analysis by per capita showed that when superannuation is frozen, that low and middle income workers actually lose out both in real wages and in foregone superannuation. So freezing superannuation is not a solution to wage growth, and that's the second point that I want to make. Seeing freezing superannuation as a lever or as a mechanism for wage growth is, in my opinion, a completely false premise. We have a government that has expressed an ideological opposition to superannuation. We have a West Australian Liberal member, for example, who called superannuation a cancer. Superannuation, when it was introduced by the Labor government, was never meant to be a safety net. It was a means of ensuring that older Australians have enough money in their retirement to live with dignity. And we will continue to pursue it, and we will continue to ensure that Australia has a robust superannuation program so that, with our ageing population, we can ensure that older Australians continue to be valued, continue to be a strong part of our economic and social fabric.
So what do you say to the Grattan Institute and ACOS, who are making the case too. It's not just some coalition MPs like Tim Wilson has just made the case. It's those groups as well. What do you say to their critique, which is very much opposite to yours? They say that actually workers need wage increases now.
They do need wage increases now. I completely agree with that, but I do not agree that superannuation is the lever for that. I think that we had Matthias Cormann come out and pretty much say that keeping wages low was a centrepiece of this government's economic plan, right? So, and wage growth has been so low under this government since they took office. In fact, the highest point of wage growth under this government is equal to the lowest point of wage growth under the Labor government in the middle of the GFC. So wage growth is an issue that needs to be dealt with. But I do not agree that superannuation and freezing superannuation is a mechanism for that. And in fact, as I mentioned, the analysis done by per capita shows that when superannuation is frozen, workers lose out not just in wages, but also in foregone superannuation.
Isn't it funny how the industry super fund-backed think tank per capita concludes that we should give more money to control of industry super funds? I mean, this is just fantasy stuff. The idea that there is this magic money tree in which everybody can just be paid more in wage and superannuation. If you don't pay more in one, that somehow you can get benefit in the other. We need to be realistic and honest with the Australian people about there are consequences to doing this. That's why we're having a review and look at all of these issues, because if you actually want a system that delivers retirement security for Australians, if you want to have a system where people are contributing to make sure that they're putting themselves in their best position, it needs to start from an honest conversation, which is when you increase superannuation guarantee, it comes at the expense of wages. Go back right to the 90s, and that was the basis of the system.
So because this is what intrigues me, Tim Wilson, that's currently the government's policy. The Treasurer, the Prime Minister have said this in Parliament when asked, that the government stands firm on this increase going forward by 2025. So are you suggesting that the government level with the Australian people and say, we're going to stick to this policy, but you should be prepared for the fact that you won't get wage increases?
Well, what the government is doing, and quite rightly, is saying we're doing a review into the whole system.
No, the government keeps saying it won't change this, though, unless you can tell me something else.
Well, no, they're doing a review, and I don't know anything else beyond the fact that they're doing a review, and when that comes back, it will obviously inform policy in the end. But we just need to be honest about the consequences and the absurdity that so many people on the Labor side of politics say, oh, no, that's not really what happens, when the Treasury, ACOS, the Reserve Bank of Australia, the Grattan Institute, countless organisations all acknowledge this fundamental point, but they continue to distract from the substance of it.
Tim, I think you're not getting the nuance here. Tim, I think you're not understanding what I'm saying here. What I'm saying here is that the per capita analysis looked at what happens when you freeze the superannuation guarantee. And therefore, if the per capita analysis shows that when you freeze the superannuation guarantee, it actually increases profits, not wages. The argument, therefore, that increasing superannuation results in lower wages is a false argument that needs to be reviewed.
Except all of those bodies saying you're wrong.
OK, let's just park that issue, but clearly it's a live one. I now know why Anthony Albanese has talked about it and why there's a debate in the Liberal Party. I think our viewers know too. Let's talk about coal and decarbonisation. I want to start with you, Tim Wilson.
Sure.
You've backed a technology target. What does that mean, and do you support zero net emissions by 2050?
Well, all I've said is consistently is that technology is the solution to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in Australia. If you want to get off some types of technology, whether it's coal or gas or anything else, and move to an alternative, then you need to put in the instruments and the mechanisms to implement it and to make sure that technology is put into the marketplace. Now, there are different ways you can achieve that, and I think having some sort of technology roadmap that seeks to achieve that, and yes, targets will probably be at least part of that conversation, is a sensible, pragmatic one to keep jobs, make sure they're well-paid jobs, but also make sure we have reliable and affordable power. And that's what Australians want to see while we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And the critical point about the technology roadmap is it then goes on to inform the type of targets we can achieve about our greenhouse gas emissions. You mentioned one there. I'm not like the Prime Minister. I want to see the substance of how you're going to get to a destination before you just pick the destination. But I'm very open-minded about how we can get there.
OK, but do you think the place that you want to get to with this technology roadmap is zero net emissions by 2050? Is that what you use the technology and the roadmap for?
Well, no. Well, firstly, we took to the last election a target of 26-28% of 2005 levels by 2030. Now, before we go to the next election, what I want the roadmap to do is say, what can we achieve within the next time frame, so 2040 and 2050, what's viable for Australia and what technologies need to be on the table to make that viable.
And do you think zero net emissions should be the ultimate goal? Is that what you think?
Well, there are different ways you can achieve emissions targets, because a lot of that's going to be dependent on whether we can sequester or take out greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. But it's not just about what Australia is doing, it's what we're going to do with technology to help other countries reduce their greenhouse gas emissions as well. So I'm not going to commit to that without knowing the impact on jobs or the time frame, but obviously I'm sympathetic to cutting emissions and cutting them as quickly as possible, but the technology is going to be a critical part of that conversation.
Dr. Anne Ali, are you convinced by that kind of approach, a technology-targeted approach that does, as Tim Wilson at least described it, work towards reducing emissions?
Look, I think there are many positives in what Tim just described. I think there are a lot of positives there. But I will say this. I watched the Foreign Correspondent show last night about Germany and how Germany has managed to transition away from coal without losing a single job and with having some relatively ambitious targets by 2050. I think that if Germany can do it, Australia can do it. Certainly Australia can do it. But
you know that
as long
bioenergy
as you have...
Let her finish. Just let her finish.
Tim, let me finish,
Sure.
Tim. Wait a minute. You'll have your go in a minute.
Good.
But as long as you have in the coalition a group of people who fundamentally do not even agree with the fundamental principle of why we need to transition away from fossil fuels, I think it's going to be a challenge. So while I agree with much of what Tim said, and I do agree that we need to be diversifying our economy, we need to be embracing the technological revolution, so to speak, I do agree with that. I think it's going to be hard to get that through a coalition party room that is so divided on this issue.
And I think, Tim, it is true, isn't it, that the coalition party room is divided because there's this huge debate that's boiled over, and we know there are many who want to see this Collinsville coal-fired power plant go ahead with taxpayer money. Do you think that would be a wise decision?
Well, firstly, the answer is no on the division. I mean, everybody in the coalition went to the last election, and the previous one, I might add, committed to the targets under the Paris Agreement of 26-28% off 2005 levels by 2030. That's what we're seeking to implement. The discussion, and there's a diversity of opinions about how we meet future targets, is now a live discussion. But I think we actually just need to analyse what Anne just said, which is she wants to get all coal jobs out, and she thinks that's a good thing. The other thing she said is, they've managed to transition. Germany's managed to
how you put words into my mouth all the time, Tim.
Luckily, they can listen to what you said, Anne, on their own. It's all going to be on iView. Yep, keep going.
But the other point is, she said, Germany managed to get off certain types of energy generation. That's because they import energy from France, nuclear power. Now, I presume she's ruling that out as well. So this is why the technology roadmap is so important, is because you've actually got to have energy generation to go from and to. You've got to have jobs to go from and to. And when you rule things out without having a proper conversation, you're actually doing huge detriment to the future of the country.
And what do you think of taxpayer money going towards a coal-fired power plant?
Well, I don't really understand this argument, because they're doing a feasibility study. If it's feasible, then they won't need any government support.
They're doing a feasibility study into taxpayer support too, right? That's on the table.
I'm sure there are any number of options on the table, but I don't see a scenario in which the federal government is going to invest in building a new coal-fired power station. If it can stand on its own 2 feet, then that's a different proposition. But I've yet to see evidence of that, but I guess that's what the feasibility study will show.
And if it does show that taxpayer money should go towards it, do you object to that?
That's not a decision for a feasibility study. That's an issue for the government to decide.
Yeah, and what do you think? As you say, you're a backbencher. You told me what you thought on superannuation.
I did, but in the end, if you have a feasibility study showing that it's viable commercially, then you don't need the taxpayer money, so it doesn't matter.
OK, I think I know what you think on this, Anne Ali, but I'll give you the final word.
Oh, look, we've already ruled out any government propping up of the coal industry. But I will say this, Patricia, I don't know how I get through my day without having Tim explain to me everything that I just said. Thank you so much, Tim.
I'll take that as a compliment.
I'll take it all as a comment. I'll just do that and say goodbye to you both. Thank you so much for joining us.
Take care.
Liberal MP Tim Wilson and Labor MP Anne Ali, and that's a wrap.